There is a door under the Great Sphinx. We know exactly where it is. We have scanned it, measured it, mapped its right angles in the bedrock. And for almost 50 years, the people who control that ground have refused to open it. This is the story of what is behind it and why nobody is allowed to find out. Let me take you there first. Giza. The Sphinx sits where it has sat for thousands of years, its paws stretched out toward the rising sun. Millions of people stand in front of it every year. They photograph the face, they photograph the body. Almost none of them look down, because the part of this monument that should terrify us is not the face. It is the floor. It is the limestone directly under the front paws, and buried inside that floor is a cavity that has no business being there. Here is the impossible part, and I want to say it plainly before we go any further. The chamber under the paws is not a crack. It is not a random fissure in the rock. The scans show 90-degree angles. They show rectangular proportions. They show walls. Nature does not carve perfect rectangles 25 feet down in solid bedrock. Something cut that space, sealed it, and walked away. And the ancient texts that survived from the people who lived in the shadow of this monument do not call it a tomb. They call it a record. A room built to hold knowledge that was meant to be hidden until a specific moment in time. So, what is actually behind the door under the Sphinx? That is the question we are going to answer. Not with mysticism. With radar data, seismic readings, drilling reports, and the exact words carved and written by people who were there. By the end of this, you will understand why the most powerful archaeological authorities on Earth would rather leave the greatest discovery in human history sealed than risk what comes out of it. If buried history unsettles you the way it unsettles me, subscribe before we go further, because this is the kind of story they would prefer you never finished. Now, the object, the Great Sphinx of Giza, is carved directly out of the bedrock of the plateau. The lion body and the outstretched paws emerge from a single limestone ridge, and in places where the natural stone was weak or eroded, the builders finished it with added blocks of masonry. That detail matters, and we will come back to it, because a monument carved out of living rock should be solid underneath. There should be nothing below the paws but more limestone all the way down. That is what every Egyptologist assumed for over a century. They were wrong. The first serious crack in that assumption came in the 1970s. Between 1973 and 1974, one of the earliest scientific probes of the plateau used ground-penetrating radar and remote sensing to look for anomalies under the bedrock. This was not a fringe operation. It ran through Ain Shams University in Cairo and the Stanford Research Institute in the United States, two of the most respected institutions in their fields. In 1977, the U.S. National Science Foundation funded a second project, again with the Stanford Research Institute, using resistivity measurements, magnetometry, and thermal infrared imaging. These were the most advanced tools available at the time. The official report from that team contained a sentence that should have changed everything. They wrote that several anomalies were observed as a result of the resistivity survey at the Sphinx. Behind the rear paws, two traverses indicated an anomaly that could possibly be due to a tunnel. Two more anomalies were noted deep in the bedrock in front of the paws. Tunnels, voids, empty space where there should have been nothing but stone. For years, scholars filed this away as inconclusive, too vague, too easy to explain as natural erosion. The findings were acknowledged and then quietly downplayed. The debate, as the records put it, continued to this day. But the technology kept improving, and the anomalies refused to go away. In 1991, a team led by geologist Robert Schoch and geophysicist Thomas Dobecki ran new seismic surveys around the monument. Their instruments detected large cavities beneath the paws and the body of the Sphinx. And critically, these cavities appeared too regular to be natural. They did not look like the random voids that water and time leave behind in limestone. They looked carved. They looked deliberate. The same anomalies, found again, by different people with better equipment. Then came 1996. A team from Florida State University, working alongside researchers from Boston University, brought ground-penetrating radar back to the enclosure. Most of the tourists walking past assumed they were doing routine maintenance. They were not. They were firing high-frequency radio waves into the limestone floor to map what the human eye could not see. And what came back on their monitors that afternoon sent a quiet shockwave through the archaeological world that is still moving today. The radar did not show solid rock. It showed a rectangular chamber roughly 25 feet beneath the paw of the Sphinx. It measured about 12 meters by 9 meters. A clean rectangle, a defined box deep in the bedrock, with edges too sharp for nature to have made. Here is the line that matters, the one that should stop you cold. Nature does not carve perfect rectangles deep underground. This was not a fault line. This was not a fissure. This was a room. And that brings us to the part everyone wants to skip past too quickly, the texts. Because the room is only half the story. The other half is what the ancient sources say is inside it. For decades, scholars dismissed the old descriptions of a hidden chamber at Giza as symbolic, as religious poetry, as the kind of thing ancient priests wrote to make their monuments sound more important than they were. The Egyptians spoke of a record house, a storehouse, a place where the knowledge of the world was preserved, sealed away, not to be opened until a specific time had been fulfilled. Mainstream Egyptology. Read those phrases the way you would read a metaphor. A spiritual idea, not a physical address. But that explanation has a problem. The descriptions are not vague, they are specific. They name a location, they describe a passage from the right forepaw leading to the entrance of the record chamber. They describe a room that may not be entered until the changes must become active in the experience of man. That is not the language of metaphor. That is the language of instructions, of a sealed vault with a condition on the lock. And when you line those instructions up against what the radar found, the words stop sounding like poetry and start sounding like a map. So let us decode this the way you would decode any real ancient source. 3 clues, 3 phrases that sound mythological at first and turn technical the moment you look closely. The first clue is the location itself. The phrase that survived describes the sealed room as connected by a chamber or passage from the right forepaw of the Sphinx. The mainstream reading treats the right forepaw as symbolic geography, a sacred direction, a poetic flourish. But here is where it gets strange. The radar anomalies across multiple independent surveys cluster in exactly that zone, under and in front of the paws. The Florida State scan placed its rectangular void directly beneath a paw. The 1970s resistivity survey flagged anomalies in front of the paws. The seismic work in the 1990s found regular cavities under the same feet. The texts said the passage begins at the forepaw. The instruments, decades later, found the void at the forepaw. The poetry and the radar are pointing at the same square of ground. The second clue is the threshold. The texts describe the sealed room sitting where the line of the shadow, or the line of light, falls between the paws as the sun rises from the waters. Read as mythology, that is just sun worship, a pretty image of dawn over a sacred statue. But read as engineering, it is a position fix. A void centered beneath the forepaws would sit at the exact symbolic threshold of the monument, the line between the lion body and the open plateau. The ancients did not say the room was somewhere under the Sphinx. They placed it at a precise threshold, marked by the sunrise, between the paws. And that is exactly where the geometric anomaly sits, not a random spot. The threshold, the doorway position. The one place a builder would put an entrance if the entire monument was designed as a marker pointing down at it. Think about what that actually requires. To place a hidden room at a threshold marked by a sunrise line, you do not just dig a hole and hope. You have to understand the angle of the rising sun across the seasons. You have to orient an entire multi-ton monument so that its paws frame that line. You have to cut the chamber so its position agrees with the geometry of the statue above it. That is not the work of people scribbling myths. That is the work of people who were recording, measuring, and building to a plan. They weren't guessing, they were engineering. And they left the answer in language we mistook for a prayer. That is the second clue. Now we get to the one no one has ever been allowed to test. The third clue is the seal itself. The texts are explicit that this room is locked, and that the lock is conditional. The chamber may not be entered until the time has been fulfilled, until the changes must be active in the sphere of man's experience. For a long time, this was read as prophecy, as religious fortune-telling. But strip away the mysticism, and you are left with something far more concrete. A vault, deliberately sealed with explicit instructions that it not be opened. Not a tomb that was robbed and forgotten. A room that was closed on purpose by people who wrote down that it must stay closed. And here is the unsettling parallel. We now have a rectangular void, scanned and measured, that has been deliberately left sealed by modern authorities who have written down, repeatedly, that it must not be opened. The ancient instruction and the modern policy say the same thing. Do not enter. The lock has simply been handed from one set of guardians to another across 4,000 years. So we have three clues. The passage at the forepaw, confirmed by radar, the threshold between the paws, confirmed by the geometry, and the conditional seal, enforced now exactly as it was written then. Three phrases that sounded like myth and turned into a location, a position, and a locked door. Then, modern science found something that made all of it harder to dismiss. In 1997, seismological studies by Joe Jahoda and Dr. Joseph Shore returned to the space under the paw. What they reported was not a fuzzy blob on a screen. It was a void that appeared, in their words, perfect in its design. 90-degree angles, rectangular proportions, the kind of geometry that does not occur in natural rock. This would suggest the space is not natural at all. It would suggest it is man-made. A cut room, a sealed box of empty air under one of the most famous objects on the planet. And the discoveries did not stop there. In recent years, two researchers, Filippo Biondi of the University of Strathclyde in Scotland and Corrado Malanga of the University of Pisa in Italy, applied a different technology entirely. Synthetic aperture radar tomography, processing satellite data to reconstruct what lies beneath the Giza Plateau. In March of 2025, they went public with claims that go far beyond a single chamber. They described an underground system stretching roughly 2 kilometers beneath the plateau. 8 vertical cylindrical wells encircled by spiral pathways descending around 648 meters into the earth. 5 identical multi-level structures near the base of the Khafre Pyramid, linked by geometric passageways. 2 massive cube-shaped chambers, each measuring around 80 meters on a side. A complex, they argued, that ties the pyramids and the Sphinx together into one enormous buried machine. Hold that number in your mind. 648 meters. More than 2,000 feet straight down. If that is real, the chamber under the paw is not the secret. It is the doorway to the secret. The front step of something so large, we do not have a category for it. And notice what keeps happening here. Every time a new generation invents a better instrument, they point it at this exact patch of ground, and the ground answers back the same way. Resistivity in the 70s, seismic in the 90s, ground-penetrating radar in 1996, seismic again in 1997. Satellite radar tomography in 2025. Different teams, different countries, different decades, different technologies that share almost nothing with each other. And the same result keeps coming up under those paws. Voids, cavities, geometry that should not be there. When one instrument finds an anomaly, you can call it an error. When 5 completely different methods across 50 years all find an anomaly in the same place, you are no longer looking at a glitch. You are looking at something real that the stone keeps refusing to hide. And here is where the wall comes down. On every attempt to look closer. No official excavation has ever entered the rectangular void under the paw. Boreholes were drilled near it back in the late 1970s, but the specific anomaly itself remains sealed and unexplored. The Egyptian Supreme Council of Antiquities has consistently denied permission to excavate these anomalies. The stated reason is preservation. The Sphinx is carved from fragile, weathered limestone, and the argument is that drilling or digging could destabilize the entire monument. That is the official explanation. And on its surface, it is reasonable. These monuments are irreplaceable. Caution makes sense, but the official explanation leaves gaps because permission has not been denied once. It has been denied again and again across decades to team after team, including projects backed by serious institutions and serious funding. Separate tunnels under the Sphinx, confirmed by a research team in 1998, appeared to have been previously excavated and then refilled. Someone, at some point, dug into the ground here and then deliberately packed it back up. And the investigation into those tunnels was suspended indefinitely, not concluded. Suspended. Left hanging, with the access sealed and the questions unanswered. The pattern repeats with the modern scans, too. The dramatic claims of a 2K underground city were met with intense pushback. Egyptologists called the depth figures technically impossible, arguing that this kind of radar can penetrate at most a few hundred meters, not 648. Critics pointed out that one of the researchers is known for fringe theories far outside archaeology, and that no independent team has confirmed the deepest structures. The findings were not peer-reviewed in the way an extraordinary claim demands. All of that is fair, all of that is true. So now, around the point where you have to make up your mind, let us slow down and be honest about it. Does any of this prove there is a hall of records under the Sphinx, a vault of lost civilization wisdom waiting under the paw? Probably not. The most extreme version of this story comes from a single source more than anything else. In the early 20th century, the American psychic Edgar Cayce, often called the Sleeping Prophet, gave trance readings in which he described a hidden chamber beneath the right paw of the Sphinx. He claimed it held the records of Atlantis, carried to Egypt by survivors of a great cataclysm. He predicted it would be discovered between 1996 and 1998. And it is worth being clear-eyed here. Cayce was not an archaeologist. He was a clairvoyant. When his supporters teamed up with scientists in the 1990s and drilled near the paw, the deeper holes reportedly showed natural rock, small cracks, no grand chamber. One geophysicist who worked the site said flatly that he paid special attention under the front paws and found no chambers at all. The Atlantis Library, the flying machines, the tunnels to inner Earth that later got attached to the legend. None of that has any physical confirmation. It is belief, not evidence. But, and this is the part that keeps the story alive, stripping away, Cayce does not make the rock under the paw ordinary. The anomalies were not invented by a psychic. They were found by Stanford, by Florida State, by Boston University, by independent seismic teams across 3 decades. The rectangular geometry, the 90-degree angles, the regular cavities, those came out of instruments, not trances. You can throw out every word Cayce ever said, and you are still left with a measured, repeatable, geometric void under the paws of the Sphinx that no one has been allowed to enter. The myth may be wrong about what is inside. That does not make the room disappear. So here is the grounded version, and it is still extraordinary. Forget Atlantis. Imagine instead that the people who built and rebuilt this monument over thousands of years did exactly what the texts say. They cut the chamber, they placed it at the threshold beneath the paws, they sealed it with the explicit written instruction that it stay sealed. Maybe it held temple records. Maybe it held the foundation deposits and ritual objects that Egyptians buried under their most sacred structures. Maybe it was a deliberate time capsule, a message preserved by a civilization obsessed with eternity, intended for a future they were certain would come. We know they buried warnings and records in tombs and temple walls and scrolls meant to survive for eternity. A sealed chamber under their most important monument is not a fantasy. It is consistent with everything we know about how they thought. And if even that grounded version is true, it means our history is missing a chapter. It means there is a sealed, intact, untouched room under the most studied monument on Earth, placed exactly where the ancient texts said it would be, and we have chosen not to open it. Not because we cannot, because someone decided we should not. That is the real weight of this, not the Atlantis story, the decision. We have the technology to look. We have had it for 50 years. The radar works, the seismic mapping works, the scans keep finding the same void in the same place. Every tool we point at the ground under those paws comes back with the same answer. There is something there. And every request to confirm what it is gets the same response. Permission denied, sealed, suspended indefinitely. Which leaves one final question, and it is the one nobody in authority will answer directly. If the chamber under the paw is empty, if it really is just natural rock and small cracks, then opening it costs nothing and ends the debate forever. A single careful borehole, a small camera, and the legend dies overnight. So why, after 50 years, has no one been allowed to take that simple look? Why keep refusing, decade after decade, to settle a question that one afternoon of work could close? You do not guard an empty room this carefully. You do not refuse, again and again, to open a door with nothing behind it. The Sphinx is still sitting there tonight. The paws are still stretched toward the horizon, exactly as they have been for thousands of years. And 25 feet beneath them, in the dark, sealed inside the bedrock, is a perfect rectangle of empty space that the texts say holds a record meant for a future generation. It was scanned, it was measured, it was mapped, and then the people in charge closed the file and walked away. The door under the Sphinx is still locked, the texts still say what is behind it, and the time they wrote about, the moment the seal was finally meant to break, may be closer than anyone in power wants to admit. If this is the kind of buried history that keeps you awake, the next investigation on screen goes even deeper under Giza, into the part of this story they tried hardest to bury. Watch it now, before it gets taken down.